Chuck Norris was cruising the winding backroads of southern Texas, the sun blazing overhead like a fiery hammer, when his cherished vintage 1969 Camaro began to cough and stutter. At first, he brushed it off, giving the dashboard a reassuring tap, but within moments the engine let out a final groan and died completely. The car coasted to a reluctant stop at the side of the empty road, surrounded by miles of dry, golden fields swaying lazily in the warm breeze. Chuck climbed out, the heat wrapping around him like a heavy blanket, and shaded his eyes as he scanned the horizon. Nothing but open land and an endless stretch of road ahead and behind. He could have called for help, but something about the situation nudged him to look around first. That's when he spotted it, a battered wooden sign nailed to a leaning post, barely visible through the shimmering heat waves. Gus Auto Repair. 2 miles ahead. Chuck squared his jaw and started walking, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel shoulder. Each step stirred tiny clouds of dust that clung stubbornly to his jeans. The sun pounded mercilessly against his back, but Chuck didn't waver. He'd walked tougher roads in his life. After what felt like an eternity, but was really about 20 minutes, a small, ramshackle garage came into view. A scattering of rusted-out car frames littered the yard like ancient bones. An ancient Coke machine buzzed forlornly by the door, and a hand-painted sign above the open bay read simply, Gus. Inside the garage, a wiry old man in oil-streaked overalls was half-buried under the hood of an old Ford pickup. His silver hair stuck out from under a weathered ball cap, and his boots tapped lightly to the beat of some unseen song. Chuck approached quietly, clearing his throat when he was a few feet away. The man straightened up slowly, wiped his hands on an equally filthy rag, and turned toward him. His face was a patchwork of sun wrinkles, and his sharp blue eyes twinkled with life. Without hesitation, he stuck out a hand. "Name's Gus," he said in a voice rough as sandpaper but warm. Chuck shook his hand, feeling the strength still lingering in the old man's grip. "Chuck," he replied simply. Gus raised an eyebrow, but didn't react otherwise. "Chuck Norris or not, a car's a car," he said with a chuckle. "What can I do you for?" Chuck felt an involuntary grin tug at the corner of his mouth. It was rare, almost unheard of, for someone not to make a big deal out of meeting him. He explained the situation, mentioning the Camaro stranded a couple of miles back. Gus nodded thoughtfully. "Let's not leave a classic out there to bake," he said. He tossed his rag onto a workbench and gestured toward an ancient tow truck that looked like it had seen World War II. The drive back was slow and bumpy, the truck rattling with every pothole, but the old radio crackled cheerful country tunes, and the cab smelled like motor oil and fresh tobacco. Gus drove with easy confidence, steering with one hand, chatting casually about the weather, the road, and the sorry state of modern engines. When they reached the Camaro, Gus gave a low whistle. "Now, that's a beauty," he said appreciatively. He circled the car, running a hand lightly over the gleaming black hood before popping it open. His eyes sharpened, and he leaned in like a doctor examining a patient. Within minutes, Gus straightened up, wiping his hands again. "Faulty fuel pump," he said confidently. "Seen it 100 times. No biggie. I'll call a buddy of mine. He'll run one over from town." Chuck was impressed. He was used to mechanics running complicated diagnostics and trying to upsell repairs. Gus worked purely by experience, instinct, and a deep love for the craft. Back at the garage, Gus made the call on an old rotary phone mounted to the wall. While they waited, he offered Chuck a stool and a bottle of cold root beer from a battered fridge. They talked, really talked, as the hours slipped by. Gus told stories of his youth racing old Chevys down back roads, tuning engines by ear, and once building a dragster in his backyard that clocked 200 miles per hour. Chuck found himself laughing, real, belly-deep laughs, more than he had in months. For once, he wasn't Chuck Norris the legend. He was just a guy with a broken car and a good seat for a great story. Finally, a dusty pickup rolled into the yard carrying the new part. Gus got to work immediately, his hands steady and sure despite his age. Watching him, Chuck was struck by the almost meditative calm with which Gus moved. Every bolt turned with precision, every cable clipped with care. Within an hour, the Camaro was rumbling again, the engine purring like a happy cat. Gus gave it one last polish, standing back to admire the reflection in the perfect black paint. When Chuck tried to pay him generously, Gus waved it off. "Tell folks Gus still knows his way around an engine," he said with a wink. "That's payment enough." Chuck stood there, genuinely touched. Not many people would refuse money, especially not in times like these. He shook Gus' hand again, this time with real gratitude. As Chuck slid behind the wheel, Gus clapped him on the shoulder. "Take good care of her," he said. "And take good care of yourself, too." Chuck nodded, revving the engine and savoring the smooth responsiveness Gus had restored. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Gus stood there, framed by the sunset, a small but somehow towering figure against the fading light. The drive home was different. He couldn't stop thinking about Gus. His easy manner, his encyclopedic knowledge of machines, his stories that seemed to hint at a life far bigger than one old garage could hold. There was something about him that stirred memories of Chuck's own mentors, old souls who had shaped him without fanfare or reward. Days passed, but the memory of Gus lingered. Chuck tried to focus on his work, training sessions, charity events, interviews, but every idle moment his mind drifted back to that sun-beaten garage and the old man with hands strong as steel. Finally, one morning he tossed a package into the passenger seat, a brand-new, high-end wrench set he thought Gus might appreciate, and turned the Camaro back toward that dusty road. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt compelled to go back. Maybe it was just to say thank you properly. Maybe it was something more. The sky was painted with streaks of gold and purple as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the landscape. Chuck drove slower this time, savoring the way the Camaro hugged the road, feeling every hum of the engine Gus had brought back to life. As he rounded the last bend, the garage came into view, but something was different. The yard, once cluttered with rusted relics, now stood eerily empty. The doors of the garage were wide open, and the Coke machine hummed louder than usual in the stillness. A strange feeling prickled the back of Chuck's neck. He pulled in slowly, parking the Camaro right out front, and stepped out. The setting sun threw his shadow long across the gravel. He called out once, twice, but there was no answer. The place wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't alive either. It was like the whole world had paused, waiting for him to take the next step. Chuck tightened his grip on the package in his hand and moved forward, the wind whispering secrets in his ear. Little did he know, what he was about to discover inside would not only shock him, it would change everything he thought he knew about Gus, about destiny, and maybe even about himself. Chuck stepped cautiously into the open bay of the garage, his boots sending small echoes across the concrete floor. The smell of motor oil and old rubber still hung in the air. But there was something else now, an emptiness that hadn't been there before, a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Tools were neatly hung on the walls, benches were wiped clean, and the floor was swept spotless. It wasn't abandoned exactly. It was more like it had been prepared, as if someone knew he was coming. He called out again, "Gus," his voice bouncing off the metal walls. No answer. Chuck wandered deeper inside, feeling strangely out of place. On the main workbench sat an envelope with his name on it, Chuck, written in a strong, steady hand. Frowning, Chuck picked it up and weighed it in his palm before slipping a finger under the flap and opening it. Inside was a simple note, written in the same hand. "If you're reading this, it means you came back. I knew you would. Sit tight and don't leave yet. Gus." A chill ran down Chuck's spine. The note felt less like a message and more like a summons. He looked around, searching for cameras, signs, anything, but the place was empty. Empty except for the Camaro, gleaming quietly outside, and the fading sunlight stretching across the bay. Chuck was about to call out again when he noticed something unusual. The back wall of the garage, the one lined with old posters and car parts, had a door he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it blended in almost perfectly with the clutter around it. The door was slightly ajar. Against every instinct telling him to be cautious, Chuck pushed it open and stepped through. Inside, the light was dim, but what he saw made him freeze in place. The room was a shrine to another life. The walls were lined with black and white photographs, all meticulously framed and organized. Some showed a young Gus, though Chuck almost didn't recognize him at first, standing beside legendary race cars, posing with groups of rugged men, shaking hands with politicians and generals. There were medals too, dozens of them, pinned in careful rows inside glass cases. Medals of honor, bronze stars, citations from organizations Chuck had only heard whispered about in elite circles. CIA commendations, NASA plaques, a photo of Gus beside a lunar lander, wearing a technician's uniform. Another with him smiling next to a group of astronauts, signed in flowing script. "Thanks for keeping us alive, Gus." Chuck's eyes widened as he moved further into the room, each photograph telling a story that didn't make any sense. How could one man have lived so many lives? He reached a small wooden pedestal in the center of the room, where an old journal rested under a sheet of glass. A note attached to it read, "For when you're ready." Something inside Chuck hesitated. He had faced down armies, climbed mountains, stared death in the face without flinching, but this felt heavier, like stepping into someone's soul. He pulled up a metal stool and sat down, lifting the glass carefully and opening the journal. The first page was simple. The truth isn't in the headlines. It's in the moments no one sees. This is my story. Page after page, Gus had written about his life. A life that spanned secret wars, engineering feats, space exploration, and quiet heroism that had never made the news. Gus had been a street racer in the 50s, a mechanic for the fastest drivers in history. Later, he was recruited into the military, not as a soldier, but as the man who kept the machines running when lives depended on them. During the Cold War, he'd been stationed across the globe, solving mechanical problems no one else could. When space travel loomed, Gus was there too, handcrafting components for missions too critical to fail. He had once, according to a modest entry, fixed a problem on a spacecraft cooling system with chewing gum and a paperclip. A story that, if true, might have saved an entire crew from disaster. Chuck read for what felt like hours, captivated by the scope of Gus' quiet, tireless contributions to history. And yet, through it all, Gus never sought fame. He turned down medals, awards, and public ceremonies, choosing instead a simple life where he could work with engines and help those who crossed his path. Chuck leaned back, feeling the gravity of it all. The old man who had fixed his Camaro wasn't just a good mechanic. He was a living legend in his own right, hidden away from the world, content to leave no footprint larger than necessary. A sound interrupted Chuck's thoughts, the soft whirring of an engine outside. He stood quickly, setting the journal down carefully, and made his way back through the door into the main garage. Outside, a sleek, black motorcycle had pulled up. The rider, dressed in simple jeans and a leather jacket, took off his helmet and tucked it under his arm. It wasn't Gus. The man was younger, maybe in his 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air about him. He approached with easy confidence and stopped a few feet away from Chuck. "You must be Chuck," the man said. Chuck nodded slowly. "And you are?" "Name's Harris," the man replied. Well, let's just say I work for the kind of people who knew Gus real well." Chuck raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "You're late. I already read the book." Harris smiled slightly, almost respectful. "Good. That saves time." He reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope, handing it to Chuck. "Gus wanted you to have this if you came back. Said you would. Said he trusted you." Chuck accepted the envelope, feeling the weight of whatever was inside. "And where's Gus?" Chuck asked, his voice low. Harris's smile faded. He looked off toward the horizon for a moment before replying. Gus isn't here anymore. He was sick, but he didn't want anyone fussing over him. Figured he'd slip away quiet, like he lived. Passed a few nights ago. Peaceful. Didn't suffer." Chuck swallowed hard, the news hitting like a body blow. He had felt something, the emptiness of the garage, the prepared letter, the strange stillness. Somehow, Gus had known his time was up, and he had left everything ready for the next chapter. Harris continued, his voice softer now. "He asked that his real story stay hidden, but he figured you might be the exception. Said you'd know what to do with it." Chuck looked down at the envelope. For a long moment, neither man said anything. The sun was dipping below the horizon now, painting the sky in brilliant flames of orange and red, as if the universe itself was paying tribute. Finally, Chuck tucked the envelope into his jacket and looked Harris in the eye. "Tell whoever you work for. Gus' story is safe with me." Harris nodded, swinging a leg over his motorcycle. He revved the engine, gave Chuck a final, respectful salute, and disappeared down the road in a trail of dust. Chuck stood alone in the twilight, feeling the weight of everything he had learned settle into his bones. He thought of the lives Gus had touched, the astronauts, the soldiers, the dreamers who had crossed paths with him, and felt humbled to have been counted among them, even for just a short time. He looked around the garage one last time, the Camaro purring quietly beside him like a loyal friend. This place was more than a shop. It was a temple to a forgotten kind of heroism, the kind that didn't need spotlights or applause. Chuck turned toward the car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as he drove off into the night, Gus' envelope pressing against his chest like a heartbeat. He didn't know exactly what Gus had left him, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't just a gift. It was a mission, and Chuck Norris never left a mission unfinished. Chuck drove through the night, the stars like frozen sparks above him, his mind whirling faster than the Camaro's roaring engine. The envelope lay on the seat beside him, unopened, humming with a silent energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He could almost feel Gus' voice in the wind, urging patience, telling him to choose the right moment. By the time he reached home, a sprawling ranch hidden deep in the hills, dawn was just beginning to paint the sky in faint strokes of pink and lavender. Chuck parked the Camaro under the carport, sat for a long moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, then grabbed the envelope and went inside. The house was quiet, save for the low crackle of embers still burning in the fireplace. He moved to his favorite old oak desk, sat down heavily, and placed the envelope in front of him like it was some sacred relic. His hands were steady, but his heart was pounding harder than it had in years. He slid a knife under the flap and opened it carefully. Inside, there were two things: a letter folded neatly and a small, metal key attached to a leather cord. Chuck picked up the letter first, unfolded it, and began to read. "Chuck, if you're reading this, then you're the man I hoped you'd turn out to be. Not just strong. Anyone can be strong, but good. There's a difference. You care enough to come back. You cared enough to wonder. This key opens a lockbox hidden in the garage, behind the north wall panel. You'll find instructions there, but I want you to understand something first. You were meant to find me. It wasn't chance. It never was. Years ago, before you were even famous, I heard about you. Special Forces buzzed with your name long before Hollywood did. You had something different, something old, ancient, a spirit that can't be trained, only born. We called men like you the line, the ones who stand between chaos and order when no one else can. I was part of an old project once, one that searched for men like you. And if you're still the man I believe you are, it's your turn to take up something that's been waiting a long, long time. Use the key and trust yourself. See you down the road, kid. Gus." Chuck sat back, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. The line, "Hidden projects?" His instincts told him this wasn't just some poetic rambling. Gus meant every word. And Chuck knew he wouldn't get answers by sitting around. Fueled by a deep, rising urgency, Chuck grabbed a flashlight and headed back to the garage. His boots thudded against the floorboards as he worked quickly, finding the north wall, examining it closely until he spotted it. A slight indentation, almost invisible to the naked eye. He pressed on it, and with a quiet click, a hidden panel swung open. Behind it was a heavy metal safe about the size of a carry-on suitcase. There was no keypad, no electronic locks, just an old-fashioned keyhole. Chuck reached into his pocket, pulled out Gus' key, and slipped it into the lock. The safe creaked open, revealing a single, meticulously wrapped package and another letter on top of it. Chuck tore open the second letter. The package contains something very old and very important. It has passed through generations of guardians. Some use it for good, some for power. I trust you to know the difference. There are coordinates enclosed. A place in the desert, a few hours west of here. You'll know what to do once you're there. One last thing, You're not alone. You never were. When the time comes, others will find you. Just like you found me. Good luck, kid. With a deep breath, Chuck lifted the package from his safe. It was heavier than it looked. Carefully, he peeled away the layers of canvas and oilcloth to reveal what lay beneath. It was a box, ancient, ornately carved, made from some dark, almost black wood that seemed to drink in the light. Symbols he didn't recognize covered its surface, not just decorative but purposeful. He could feel it in his gut. This box wasn't just old. It was powerful. He turned it in his hands, feeling a subtle vibration under his fingers as if the wood itself was alive, humming with restrained energy. There was no visible latch, no keyhole, nothing. Yet Chuck knew instinctively it wasn't meant to be opened here. Gus' instructions had been clear: take it to the desert. The rising sun poured golden light across the horizon as Chuck threw a backpack together. Water, provisions, a pistol, just in case, and gently placed the ancient box inside. He strapped the pack to the passenger seat and gunned the Camaro's engine once more, pointing the nose westward. Hours later, Chuck found himself rumbling across a narrow dirt trail that snaked through a landscape of jagged rocks and endless sand. The GPS had long since given up. He was navigating now by instinct, guided only by the hand-drawn map Gus had included. Finally, he crested a rise and saw it. A lonely stone outcropping shaped eerily like a clenched fist, exactly as Gus had drawn. Chuck parked at its base, feeling the heat radiate off the rocks in shimmering waves. Slinging the backpack over one shoulder, he began to climb. The climb wasn't difficult, but somehow every step felt heavier, as if the air itself thickened the closer he got. His muscles burned, but he pressed forward, feeling that invisible pull, stronger with every heartbeat. When he reached the summit, he found a shallow depression in the rock, an altar worn smooth by centuries of sun and wind. Chuck placed the box gently on the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, under the merciless desert sun, the carvings on the box began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Chuck stepped back instinctively as the box unfolded itself, ancient mechanisms clicking and whirring silently, as though awakening from a 1,000-year slumber. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red velvet, was a simple metal cuff, a bracer, etched with the same symbols that covered the box. And somehow, impossibly, Chuck understood, this wasn't just an artifact. It was a key, a test, a responsibility. The journal, the safe, the letters, they had all been preparing him for this. Gus hadn't been just a mechanic, a soldier, a wanderer. He had been a guardian, one in a long line of protectors who kept the world in balance without ever seeking recognition. And now it was Chuck's turn. He reached out slowly, feeling a strange warmth radiating from the bracer. The moment his fingers brushed it, a flood of memories that weren't his own flashed behind his eyes. Battles fought in ancient lands, vows made in forgotten tongues, sacrifices rendered for the sake of countless lives. A history of silent warriors stretching back into the mist of time. Gritting his teeth against the torrent of visions, Chuck slipped the bracer onto his forearm. It molded perfectly to his skin, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The moment it locked into place, the world shifted. The sun seemed to burn brighter. The wind carried strange whispers. Chuck felt different. Stronger, yes, but also rooted, as if he could feel the heartbeat of the earth itself thrumming in his chest. He looked down at his arm, the bracer gleaming faintly, and understood at last. This was why he had found Gus. This was why the Camaro had broken down that day. This was his destiny. As he stood there atop the stone fist, the desert stretching out endlessly in all directions, Chuck Norris, protector of the line, accepted the ancient burden passed to him, a burden older than any nation, older than any legend. He turned slowly, the wind whipping his hair, and gazed out over the vast, wild world. Somewhere out there, forces were moving, forces that had been waiting, watching, preparing for the next guardian to rise. Chuck smiled grimly. He was ready, and heaven help anyone who tried to stand against him.